Louis Moe, or to give him his full name, Louis Maria Niels Peder Halling Moe, was born just outside the town of Arendal in Norway in 1857, the son of a dentist. In 1875, at the age of 18, he travelled to Copenhagen, and in the following year he enrolled at the Academy of Fine Arts in the city. And in the early 1880s, he also studied with the respected painter and sculptor Laurids Tuxen, while attempting to launch his own career as an artist. I have no idea how successful or otherwise he was as a painter, but the earliest examples of illustration work I found date from 1891, by which time he was 34 years old. This was a picture book for young children, Rim og Renser, and it was printed in both monochrome and in colour, using the chromolithographic print process. Despite the obvious period nature of the scenes and characters' clothing, Moe's actual style was remarkably forward-looking, using a pleasing combination of colour washes and quite minimal but tellingly hatched penwork, with endearing character evocations. He followed this with an entirely different commission, a collection of rousing sepia-tinted lithographic images for the book Denmark's History in Pictures, published in 1892. All of them were clear demonstrations of a confident and expressive approach to densely hatched line work, which gave all the elements in any picture considerable solidity. They were uniformly confident in their composition, and the book was reprinted several times in subsequent years to meet demand. Like so much else about his life and work, there is no record of whether he used posed models to create these complex scenes, but it would be fairly surprising if he didn't. In the same year he also illustrated a retelling of Hansel and Gretel, but all I could find of usable quality was this single colour page. But I fared considerably better with the following year's colour edition of Little Red Riding Hood. All the line and wash illustrations for this book told the tale with little need of text, and it was a tightly sequenced series of considerable quality, although it did stay clear of the gorier elements of the Grimm brothers' original dark telling. 1895 saw the publication of another children's book, Between Trolls, written by Emma Kraft. This time around the illustrations were all executed and printed in black and white only. But the quality of his amusing, densely inked illustrations was nobody's idea of a disappointment. In the same year there were more monochromes for Kitzwalder by Holger Drachmann, but this was not a book for younger children, and both the romantic adventure subject matter and Moe's more representational approach to figure work reflected this. Although now effectively a permanent resident in Denmark, Moe returned to Norway for a few months in every year and stayed at his farmhouse built in 1896 in Vrodel in the Telemark region, and the area became an important source of inspiration for his painted artistic work. A year later he married Inger Muller, and in 1898 no less than another 3 books illustrated by Moe were published. There was a large collection of pen and ink vignettes for selected scriptures by J. H. Whistle, which made for an absorbing visualization of the light-hearted narrative, once more using only slightly caricatured anatomy, and in this case an almost total absence of background elements. The same year saw the publication of Moe's illustrated edition of the History of the Danes, originally written in the 12th century by Saxo Grammaticus, but it contained painted half-tone printed monochromes from Moe rather than his usual hatched pen style, and the results lacked definition by comparison. The third publication of 1898 was The Bird Book, a collection of pen and ink drawings which incorporated the framed text and made pleasing use of the simpler end of his expressive line work. A year later his monochrome edition of The 1001 Nights was published, but although the images were workmanlike in their execution, they were somewhat stiff compared to his other pen and ink drawings of the period. Around the turn of the century, Moe started to create a long-running series of fantasy-themed etchings of remarkable sophistication and visual impact. Some were quite playful in their approach, but they were seriously outnumbered by much darker themes, quite a few of which involved personifications of death and demons. But what united them all was their refusal to even consider depiction of anything approaching reality or contemporary life in their subject matter. No less importantly, they displayed a level of skill and aesthetic consideration in the execution of the images, and Moe's mastery of this far from easy reprographic process, which rendered them impossible to ignore. He created these images as art in the form of limited edition prints for exhibition and sale to collectors, and very quickly they came to be in high demand. Consequently, this other side of Moe's creativity continued to be an important aspect of his work for the rest of his career, but he maintained an equal interest in the production of more child-friendly material in the form of picture books. And in 1901 he published a collection of traditional nursery rhymes with a series of quite minimally hatched comical pen drawings, with predominantly flat lithographic colour. This was an engaging publication, and the page layouts were imaginatively structured, although Moe's usual fluid approach to anatomy was somewhat absent. Following this publication, the evidence indicates that he was almost exclusively involved with yet more allegorical and dark menacing limited edition etchings, although there were quite a few lighter moments in evidence too. By the middle of the decade, his etchings, whether sinister, frivolous or both, were frequently being created as aquatints in muted colours with very agreeable results. And it wasn't only etchings he was creating. This compelling classic fantasy image was produced by drawing directly onto lithographic stone in crayon, and closer inspection reveals the remarkable level of his expressive skills in this technique too. During the Great War, Denmark remained neutral, and consequently Moe could carry on with both his prints and the occasional painting without significant disruption. And the volume, quantity and diversity of subjects, ranging from overtly humorous to unsettlingly sinister, was nothing short of remarkable during the years of the conflict. And it wasn't until 1918 that he returned to children's bookwork, when he published Burra Buss's new adventure in the Troll Forest, written by Cyrus Granair. It was a particularly engaging and engrossing story of a young boy and his encounters in the forest with a collection of anthropomorphic animals, trolls and even humanised trees. There were some page headers created in ink and monochrome wash, all of which kept up the Woodland theme. But it was the full-colour illustrations which dominated the book, and provided a collection of endearing, frequently comedic and charmingly realised full-colour line and wash-painted images. It was an understandably unprecedented success, at least in Scandinavian countries, and it led directly to quite a few more which followed with markedly similar styling and narrative content. In 1919 Moe became a Danish citizen, and in 1920 he followed the success of Burra Buss with the conspicuously similar but nevertheless equally entertaining story of Bamse, a young bear, and his adventures in the forest along with a cast of other anthropomorphic creations in support. This was another cheerful woodland fantasy, in which the illustrations dominated the use of text and evoked an idyllic environment and interplay of characters in fairly loose pen and ink style, with tonal washes to give the characters and other elements greater solidity. As if making up for lost time with children's books, in the following year his story featuring the frog Peter Croak followed the identical pattern of the two earlier successes. By this point his success in Denmark and other Scandinavian countries had spilled over into the rest of Europe, and his books were being routinely translated into other languages, including English. In the same year's story Hippo, the eponymous hero was another endearing young character who had a series of adventures over land and sea with a host of other characters, and like all good children's stories, resolved with a happy ending in which lessons about life have been learned. Moe was far from the only author and illustrator to persist with the same proven basic themes and structures. Beatrix Potter had had remarkable success doing just that with her woodland animal stories and watercolours. And the old adage that if something was manifestly not broken it didn't require fixing was never more true in the case of both these illustrators and authors. But despite these commercial successes, Moe continued to create prints, both as etchings and lithographs. and it's likely that the higher public profile afforded him by his book work would have led more admirers of his work to the other side of his fantasy prints and increase his success in that arena too. And although his prints had little, if anything, in common with his children's work, they too at least suggested some sort of menacing narrative, which made them just as compelling for adults as the books were for children. In 1926, The Green Fiddler picture book was published, featuring a lead character who was a violin-playing grasshopper. So Moe at least switched from the idea of a young cute protagonist, but again the evocation of the microcosmic world of smaller creatures was evoked with considerable charm and authenticity. And although the same year's story of Chicky Cluck did revert to an infant protagonist and a much more sentimental, heartwarming narrative, this time around there was also unexpected interaction with a young girl character. But Moe did break the pattern from his by now expected line and wash Woodland picture books in that year with a pen and ink collection for the stories of Hans Andersen, published in 2 volumes, and which he had been working on for 2 years prior to publication. This was a significantly large commission involving in excess of 100 individual images. The quality and expressive nature of his intensely hatched illustrations made each one a compelling pleasure, and the moments from each story were well chosen. Some were smaller and set within the text, but no less fascinating, but many more were full-page illustrations, each of which illuminated telling moments within each of Andersen's classic fairy tales. But despite the dedication and work demanded of a narrative project of this size and his colour picture books, there was no apparent letting up of limited edition print work produced, and it seems his imagination in all aspects of his output was a virtually bottomless well. And in 1929 he deviated from what had by now become his expected commercial territory with a series of compelling monochromes for the epic Nordic verse Ragnarok, which was rendered in pen and ink with varying levels of expressive gestural hatching. And this less overtly controlled and far from representational approach imbued the work with considerable distinctive visual character. 1930 saw a return to his more expected output with The Picnic in the Forest, which was crammed with good-natured jolly scenes of pretty much every anthropomorphic woodland animal you could think of. And by giving his young audience more of what they loved him for, this was a particularly popular offering. And despite the march of time, Moe continued to dress his characters in fanciful Victorian and Edwardian costume, which gave the books additional nostalgic appeal. In 1931, Moe broke the mould again when he both wrote and illustrated The Valkyrie, a book for children, but more an illustrated novel than a picture book, which was some considerable distance from the expected Wagnerian drama the name of these Nordic mythological figures brings to mind. It was more a story which, although not without some reference to heroic myth, was far more concerned with young children and mermaids alongside more expected characters and imagery. It wasn't without some rousing moments though, and the busy ink renders of all the images and their engrossing narrative prowess added considerably to the book's success. His remarkable productivity continued at this time with the publication of the Woodland fairy tale Tron, published in 1931 with a collection of looser and more energetically rendered than usual, but still engaging colour illustrations to visually reflect the charm of this gentle narrative. There is no doubt that, like others, Moe had found his place as a commercial children's illustrator and wasn't straying from his proven successful path. But that's what his art was for, and the two occupations continued in tandem with equal success. In 1932 he returned to another display of accomplished anthropomorphism with the story of the Begging Bear, which followed the identical winning formula of his earlier similarly successful books. And despite now being 75 years old, there was no sign of decline in either his imagination or graphic skills. In the same year he also published Nally and Michael's Adventure, another anthropomorphic triumph in ink and watercolour, which, although stylistically similar, was unusually presented in portrait format, with the images and text involving some visual interplay and almost comic strip sequencing of the images. In terms of verifiably dated work of any kind, I found no more later than this, and Louis Moe died in Copenhagen in 1945 at the age of 88. Following his death, many of Moe's picture books continued to be republished throughout Europe, and for a while at least, new generations of children could continue to enjoy them. Unfortunately, my searches seem to suggest that the only way to acquire any of these now is through the second-hand market online, which seems a real pity. But more positively, unlike many others I've featured in this series who languish in the dark corners of the internet, Moe's work is well represented in the National Gallery in Oslo and the Danish Museum of Art and Design in Copenhagen, among others. And a Louis Moe gallery has been established in Vrådal. Why other nations can't find it in themselves to give similar appreciation for their illustrators, I have no idea.